Dawn came softly over Oahu on the morning of December 7th, 1941. A pale gold glow spreading across the ridges of the Koolau Range and drifting down toward the quiet bases of the United States Pacific Fleet. It was a Sunday, a day of rest, a day when no one expected danger to cross the thousands of miles of ocean that separated Hawaii from the Empire of Japan. The island moved at an easy, peaceful rhythm. Kitchens warmed up for breakfast, card games lingered in barracks, and battleship crews prepared for another slow morning of routine duties. Far above the shoreline on a windy ridge known as Opana Point, two young soldiers were already awake and working their shift at a strange and little understood machine, the SCR-270 radar set. They were Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, both in their early 20s, both trained for a task that most of the Army barely understood. Radar was a new technology, experimental, unproven, and lacking the respect of senior officers. Many believed that it could be helpful in theory, but few trusted it in practice. To most commanders, it was a curiosity, a machine still being tested, a tool for the future rather than a shield for the present. Yet to the two men in that lonely outpost, the radar was already familiar. They knew the hum of its generator, the sweep of its antenna, the flicker of its oscilloscope. They knew how to read its signals, and how to recognize the irregular shapes of local flights, the small clusters that marked training aircraft, and the tiny smudges that revealed the slow movements of coastal traffic. The outpost itself was bare bones, little more than a hut with cables, boxes, and the towering antenna that rose above the ridge like the skeleton of some metallic beast. The truck that carried them up each morning rattled on the rough path, and when it drove back down the ridge, the two men were left alone with the wind, the hum of the equipment, and the open sky. The shift after sunrise was usually quiet, almost empty. The SCR-270 radar set rarely picked up anything unusual at that hour, normally only scattered training flights or routine movements from the nearby airfields, and even those were predictable. Clean blips moving across the screen in ways the men had come to recognize at a glance. But beneath that calm morning surface, the Pacific was hiding something vast and terrible. Far beyond the American horizon, 6 Japanese carriers had already launched their strike force, more than 180 aircraft advancing in tight formation, their engines beating against the sky as they sped toward Oahu. The pilots had been briefed, their timing was precise, their routes exact, and they were now entering the critical final stretch, closing the distance minute by minute. The Americans did not know this. They could not hear the distant swell of engines, nor see the shadows moving high above the endless blue. And so life continued as always. The radar men adjusted knobs, noted readings, and waited for the shift to end, while the island below them prepared for another easy Sunday. Lockard leaned over the radar controls, running a standard test sweep, his hands moving automatically through motions performed hundreds of times before. Elliott, beside him, tracked the faint lines with a grease pencil, marking the small patterns as part of his training. Neither expected anything beyond regular activity. The sun grew brighter, the wind softened, and still the radar hummed steadily, its wide electronic gaze sweeping out over the ocean. The two men had no reason to believe that this morning would be any different. Intelligence reports had mentioned rising tension with Japan, but Washington analysts believed that any attack, if it came, would be directed toward the Philippines or British Malaya, not Hawaii. And the commanders on Oahu felt the same way. They had been warned in general terms, but no one imagined a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and certainly not on a Sunday at daybreak. As Lockard adjusted the range settings on the radar unit, he expanded the scan far beyond normal practice. It was an automatic gesture, a technical habit, but it placed the radar in the perfect mode to pick up something at extreme distance, something that would otherwise have drifted across the screen unnoticed. At first, everything looked normal, the faint lines, the scattered minor signals.
Then, as the antenna completed another sweep, something new appeared. A smudge, no larger than a fingertip, but darker, thicker, more solid than anything the men had ever seen. Elliot leaned forward, puzzled. He sharpened the pencil line as the next sweep passed, and the smudge grew larger. This was no local flight, no pair of training aircraft, no coastal patrol. It was something massive, maybe dozens of planes, maybe more. Lockard increased the gain. The line thickened, stretched, widened across the oscilloscope in a way that made the air inside the hut feel suddenly heavier. For the first time that morning, unease crept in. There had never been a signal like this, not from any American formation, not from any routine activity on the island. Elliot and Lockard looked at each other in disbelief. Neither fully understood what they were seeing, but both knew it was significant. The quiet morning seemed to tighten around them. The hum of the radar grew louder in their ears as the sweeping arm traced the sky again and again, feeding the machine a signal that was becoming unmistakable. A large formation of aircraft was approaching Oahu, and it was coming fast. The world outside still looked peaceful. The ocean still glittered under the rising sun, and the airfields below them still rested in their Sunday calm. But inside the tiny radar hut, something had changed. The future had shifted. The first hint of disaster had appeared as a ghostly shape on a flickering screen. And though neither soldier could yet grasp the scale of what was coming, both men sensed that this moment was different, that this morning was no longer ordinary, that something unseen was racing toward Hawaii, and that within minutes the peace around them would be torn apart forever.
At 7:02 in the morning, the radar screen at Opana Point lit up with a shape that should not have existed, a thick, dark mass that grew larger with every sweep of the antenna, like a storm cloud forming out of nothing. The oscilloscope glowed faintly in the dim hut as Joseph Lockard leaned closer, his pulse rising. He had never seen anything like this. Neither had George Elliot, who stared at the expanding trace as if willing it to make sense. In training, they had been taught what normal looked like: small clusters, tidy lines, predictable movement. But this was something entirely different. A formation so large it swallowed the screen in one broad smear of energy. Elliot ran a quick calculation based on the distance scale, muttering under his breath. The signal was coming from the north, perhaps a little northeast, far out over the ocean, too far to be any local traffic, and definitely too large to be a handful of aircraft. The men glanced at each other, and for a moment there was only the sound of the radar hum, an almost living pulse that filled the cramped space. The signal grew stronger, darker, more defined, as if the sky itself was shouting a warning that no one else could hear. Elliot wiped the grease pencil line and marked the next sweep, his voice steady but tense. "That is a huge flight." Lockard nodded, though his stomach tightened. It seemed impossible. The Army Air Forces had no scheduled flights of that size, and certainly none approaching from that direction. The only aircraft expected that morning were a small group of B-17s arriving from the mainland, and they were coming from the east, not the north. The formation on the radar screen moved too fast, too tight, too purposefully. It was like watching the shadow of something massive approaching unseen across the sky. As the minutes passed, the signal doubled in size, then tripled. The smudge stretched across the oscilloscope in a thickening bar that left no doubt an enormous formation of aircraft was inbound. Elliot swallowed. There is no way this is routine. Lockard felt the same dread, though he said nothing at first. He simply adjusted the controls, trying to sharpen the image, but each adjustment only confirmed what they already knew. This was real. The formation was closing in. They could track its advance, sweep after sweep, each pass pulling it closer to Oahu. The men knew they had to report it. Elliot grabbed the phone, connecting to the information center at Fort Shafter, while Lockard watched the screen like it contained the fate of the entire island. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Inside the hut, the silence tightened around them. Elliot explained what they were seeing, his voice urgent but respectful. The voice on the other end belonged to Lieutenant Kermit Tyler,
an officer new to radar procedures and serving only his second shift ever at the center. Tyler listened but hesitated. He knew about the incoming B-17s, the flight expected that morning. He assumed that was what the men were seeing, and without full knowledge of radar intricacies, he made a decision that would echo through history. He told them to not worry about it. Elliot froze, unsure. He repeated the size of the formation, trying to convey its scale, its speed, its impossibility. But the reply was the same. Do not worry about it, it is probably the B-17s. Elliot hung up slowly, stunned. Lockhart stared at him. What did he say? Elliot answered, his voice low. He said to forget it. A long silence settled into the hut, but the oscilloscope kept moving, kept glowing, kept growing darker with each sweep. The formation was now enormous, the biggest they had ever seen. There was no chance this was a dozen aircraft or even 24. It was far beyond that. Their warning had been given, their duty technically done, but both men felt a cold weight settle on them. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Outside, the wind softened, the sky brightened, and the island below continued its easy Sunday rhythm, unaware that more than 180 Japanese aircraft were cutting through the sky toward them at attack speed. The radar image thickened into a solid band, now unmistakable, undeniable. A mass of planes so large the screen struggled to hold its outline. Lockhart whispered almost to himself, "This is no training flight." As Elliot marked the next sweep, his hand shook slightly. The realization settled in with grim clarity. They were likely the only two men on Oahu who knew what was coming, and no one had believed them. The formation moved closer, its echo filling the oscilloscope like a heartbeat counting down the minutes. The ghosts on the screen were not ghosts at all. They were real engines, real bombs, real pilots, determined and approaching fast. Beyond the hills, beyond the horizon, beyond the fragile calm of the island, a storm of metal, thunder, and fire was racing toward Pearl Harbor, unseen by every eye except two young radar operators who could do nothing now but watch as the signal surged forward, marking the final moments of peace before history split open forever.
The radar trace continued to thicken across the oscilloscope as the minutes passed, forming a dark bar so wide that it nearly swallowed the screen. The antenna at Oahu Point kept sweeping in its steady rhythm, feeding new data into the machine with every rotation, and each sweep confirmed what Joseph Lockhart and George Elliot already knew. A massive formation of aircraft was racing toward Oahu at attack speed. Yet even as the evidence grew impossible to ignore, the weight of the dismissed warning hung over the hut like a heavy fog. Elliot still held the phone in his hand, staring at it as if hoping the line might ring again, hoping the officer might call back with urgency and new orders. But the device remained silent and cold. The voice of Lieutenant Kermit Tyler echoed in his memory. "Do not worry about it. It is probably the B-17 flight." Tyler had spoken with confidence, but confidence built on assumption, not knowledge, and certainly not radar training. Elliot replayed the conversation in his mind, line by line, tone by tone, wondering if he had failed to explain the magnitude enough, wondering if he had sounded uncertain or too cautious, if he should have insisted harder, should have demanded a supervisor, should have broken protocol and raised the alert directly. But he had done what soldiers were taught to do. He had followed the chain of command, and the chain of command had snapped under the weight of a single incorrect assumption. Lockhart adjusted the radar controls again, his movements tense. The massive blip on the screen crawled closer with every sweep. The formation was now only minutes from the island, the signal so strong that it distorted slightly at the edges, proof of both its size and its nearness. Elliot stepped closer to the screen, his voice low and unsettled. "We cannot ignore this, Joe." Lockhart looked at him, eyes tight with frustration. "I know we cannot, but they already told us to stand down." Elliot clenched his jaw. He felt the helplessness growing inside him like a stone sinking deeper. He had been trained to identify targets, to read the machine, to spot danger long before anyone else.
but he had never been trained to override a superior officer, never been told what to do when the truth was on the radar screen but disbelief was in the command post. He turned to the phone again, his hand hovering over the receiver. But he hesitated. The doubt was not in his mind. The doubt was in the system, in the hierarchy of a military that did not yet understand how to use its own new technology. Outside the small hut, the wind shifted and carried the distant sound of crashing surf from the northern shore. The horizon held its calm blue. The rising sun spread warm light across the island, and for a moment, the peaceful morning almost seemed to mock them. Below, at Pearl Harbor, sailors were tying lines, drinking coffee or preparing for inspection, some still asleep in their bunks. Officers reviewed paperwork. Crews on the battleships Arizona and Oklahoma moved through their routines with no awareness that death was approaching overhead at attack speed. The island of Oahu breathed in a slow, unaware rhythm, while the soundless trace on a radar screen predicted catastrophe. Lockhart continued tracking the signal, his pencil marking the sweeps with growing urgency. "It keeps growing," he said under his breath. The formation was now just north of the island, its direction precise, its speed unwavering. No drift, no scatter, no sign of a training formation, only a perfect forward march, the mark of a strike force conditioned, drilled, and timed to the second. Elliot paced the small hut, his boots scraping lightly across the floor. He wanted to act, he wanted to shout, he wanted to run down the hill and warn someone, anyone. But the rational soldier inside him understood the brutal truth. 2 radar operators could not sound base-wide alarms on their own authority. They could only report, and they had reported. They had done their duty. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed on them with crushing force. They were the only ones who had seen it, and the only ones being ignored. Lockhart looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we are right?" he asked. The question hung between them, thick and heavy. Elliot knew the answer, even though he did not want to say it aloud. Then Pearl Harbor is in danger. The next sweep confirmed that the aircraft were now nearly over the island, their symbol on the screen stretching almost into a straight bar, meaning the formation was no longer far away, but directly inbound. The radar could no longer distinguish the distance between individual planes. The mass was too dense, too close, too overwhelming. Elliot stared at the image in disbelief. How could anyone mistake this for the B-17 flight? The expected group of American bombers numbered barely a dozen planes, and they were coming from California, not the north, and certainly not in an arrowhead formation at high speed. Everything about the radar image screamed hostile, even if the operators could not yet understand the scale of what would soon unfold on the island. For a moment, silence swallowed the hut, except for the pulsing hum of the radar generator. Outside, the wind died down, the ocean stilled, and the final minutes of peace slipped away. The signal on the oscilloscope surged again, the formation now crossing the last invisible threshold between approach and arrival. Elliot exhaled slowly, feeling dread settle deep inside him. "We should have been heard," he murmured. Lockhart nodded, his voice tight. "We were the only ones who saw them, and we are the only ones who know the truth." Elliot stepped outside the hut for a moment, the noise of the generator fading behind him. He looked across the northern coast of Oahu. The sky was clear, calm, innocent. There was no hint of metal or engines, no glint of sunlight off wings, no warning at all, just the quiet beauty of a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that seemed incapable of holding violence. But he felt it coming, like pressure before a storm, invisible but unmistakable. Inside the hut, the radar trace thickened into a final heavy smear, signaling that the aircraft were now almost directly overhead, but too high and too far north for anyone below to notice. Elliot stared at the image in disbelief. How could anyone mistake this for the B-17 flight? The expected group of American bombers numbered barely a dozen planes, and they were coming from California, not the north, and certainly not in an arrowhead formation at high speed. Everything about the radar image screamed hostile, even if the operators could not yet understand the scale of what would soon unfold on the island. For a moment, silence swallowed the hut, except for the pulsing hum of the radar generator. Outside, the wind died down, the ocean stilled, and the final minutes of peace slipped away. The signal on the oscilloscope surged again, the formation now crossing the last invisible threshold between approach and arrival. Elliot exhaled slowly, feeling dread settle deep inside him. "We should have been heard," he murmured. Lockhart nodded, his voice tight. "We were the only ones who saw them, and we are the only ones who know the truth." Elliot stepped outside the hut for a moment, the noise of the generator fading behind him. He looked across the northern coast of Oahu. The sky was clear, calm, innocent. There was no hint of metal or engines, no glint of sunlight off wings, no warning at all, just the quiet beauty of a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that seemed incapable of holding violence. But he felt it coming, like pressure before a storm, invisible but unmistakable. Inside the hut, the radar trace thickened into a final heavy smear, signaling that the aircraft were now almost directly overhead, but too high and too far north for anyone below to notice. Elliot stared at the image in disbelief. How could anyone mistake this for the B-17 flight? The expected group of American bombers numbered barely a dozen planes, and they were coming from California, not the north, and certainly not in an arrowhead formation at high speed. Everything about the radar image screamed hostile, even if the operators could not yet understand the scale of what would soon unfold on the island. For a moment, silence swallowed the hut, except for the pulsing hum of the radar generator. Outside, the wind died down, the ocean stilled, and the final minutes of peace slipped away. The signal on the oscilloscope surged again, the formation now crossing the last invisible threshold between approach and arrival. Elliot exhaled slowly, feeling dread settle deep inside him. "We should have been heard," he murmured. Lockhart nodded, his voice tight. "We were the only ones who saw them, and we are the only ones who know the truth." Elliot stepped outside the hut for a moment, the noise of the generator fading behind him. He looked across the northern coast of Oahu. The sky was clear, calm, innocent. There was no hint of metal or engines, no glint of sunlight off wings, no warning at all, just the quiet beauty of a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that seemed incapable of holding violence. But he felt it coming, like pressure before a storm, invisible but unmistakable. Inside the hut, the radar trace thickened into a final heavy smear, signaling that the aircraft were now almost directly overhead, but too high and too far north for anyone below to notice. Elliot stared at the image in disbelief. How could anyone mistake this for the B-17 flight? The expected group of American bombers numbered barely a dozen planes, and they were coming from California, not the north, and certainly not in an arrowhead formation at high speed. Everything about the radar image screamed hostile.
The massive formation that had painted itself across the oscilloscope at Opana Point finally slipped beyond the reach of the SCR-270 beams, vanishing from the screen, not because it had disappeared, but because it had crossed the final invisible threshold into the skies over Oahu. For a moment, the hut fell silent, as if the entire island had paused in a final calm breath before the world shattered far below. American sailors continued their slow Sunday routines, unaware that death was already taking shape above the northern coast. At 7:48 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft broke through the thin clouds over Kahuku Point. Sunlight flashed off metal wings as more than 180 planes descended in tight formation, torpedo bombers skimming close to the water, dive bombers climbing sharply to prepare for attack runs, and commanding fighters sweeping ahead like hawks, searching for prey. The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for this moment for months, each man briefed in exacting detail, each squadron drilled until their movements were mechanical, perfect, unstoppable. They flew southward in silence, except for the thunder of engines filling the sky.
The island citizens heard the roar first. Many mistook it for American planes on a morning training run, a common sound on Oahu. But those engines were different, deeper, more aggressive, carrying an intent that no one yet understood. At Schofield Barracks, soldiers paused and glanced upward. At Wheeler Field, some pilots sipping morning coffee looked skyward, thinking perhaps it was a formation returning early from maneuvers. At Hickam Field, air crews readied for routine duties, unaware that enemy fighters were already positioning themselves overhead. And at Pearl Harbor, the battleships lay at their moorings, quiet and still, massive silhouettes against the rising sun. Smoke did not yet rise from the water. No alarms had sounded, no orders had been shouted, but the moment of impact was only seconds away. Up on Apana Point, Elliot and Lockard stood outside their hut, staring southward, their eyes scanning the horizon. They saw nothing at first. The northern skies looked deceptively calm, but the distant, growing roar reached their ears, low at first, like wind, then louder, deeper, fuller. They exchanged a glance that needed no words. The formation on the radar screen had been real, and now it was here. Elliot whispered, "They are coming." Lockard nodded, his stomach twisting. The helplessness they had felt earlier now turning into dread that seemed to press against their ribs. Then it began. The first Japanese aircraft swooped down from the clouds, Zero fighters diving toward Wheeler Field with guns blazing. The opening bursts of gunfire cracked through the morning air, breaking the calm like shattering glass. The surprise attack had begun. In a split second, the island transformed from peaceful Sunday morning to exploding chaos. Machine guns tore across runways, catching rows of American aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip, an efficient but disastrous formation against a surprise enemy attack. Zero strafed the grounded planes, setting them ablaze before they could taxi. Crew chiefs, mechanics, pilots, everyone caught in the open, scrambled desperately for cover. At 7:55, the first torpedo bombers reached Battleship Row, flying low over the water like deadly insects, their torpedoes releasing with chilling precision. The metal cylinders streaked beneath the surface toward the anchored giants. The battleship Oklahoma took multiple hits almost immediately, her hull splitting open as she began to roll. Men tumbled from the decks into the water, screaming as she capsized within minutes. Nearby, the West Virginia shuddered under a devastating string of torpedo strikes. Flames erupted across her decks as she slowly sank, settling into the harbor mud. The Arizona stood proudly at her mooring, her flag rising in the morning air. But one Japanese dive bomber broke from formation, screamed downward, and dropped a single armor-piercing bomb. The bomb tore through her forward deck and ignited the forward magazine in a catastrophic explosion. The Arizona erupted in a towering column of fire and smoke, the blast visible across the entire island. Men were thrown into the water, debris rained from the sky. The sound echoed off the mountains like thunder, tearing through the hearts of everyone who heard it. At Hickam Field, the second wave hit. Bombers screamed downward, unleashing explosions that ripped apart hangars, barracks, and fuel storage tanks. Black smoke billowed upward, spreading across the island like a curtain of doom. The first responders struggled to act, but the attack was too fast, too coordinated, and too overwhelming. Elliot and Lockard watched from their distant ridge, their vantage point offering a horrifying panorama of the destruction. Black plumes rising from the harbor, flashes of orange fire blooming like awful flowers across the base. The faint echo of explosions reaching them seconds later. "It has begun," Elliot said, his voice barely audible. Lockard swallowed stiffly. "We tried, George. We tried." But his words felt hollow, drifting away useless against the enormity of the devastation below. At Pearl Harbor, sailors threw themselves into action, some manning anti-aircraft guns, others battling flames, many diving into the burning water to pull survivors from the wreckage. The air was filled with smoke, shouting, gunfire, and the deafening roar of engines. The Japanese pilots moved with deadly precision. Zeros patrolled the skies, firing on any American attempting to take off, while bombers pressed their assault on ships, aircraft, and facilities across the island. At Hickam Field, pilots sprinted toward burning planes, trying desperately to get airborne. A few managed to lift off under fire, engaging the attackers with bravery bordering on hopelessness. Yet even in the chaos, acts of heroism unfolded. Men helped the wounded, dragged comrades from debris, stood their ground at anti-aircraft stations, firing through smoke and heat, despite overwhelming odds. But heroism could not stop the scale of the disaster. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but those hours reshaped the world. By the time the Japanese planes turned northward to return to their carriers, the harbor burned, battleships sank or lay shattered, the airfield smoldered, and the island trembled under the weight of disbelief. Only then did the full truth settle in. The radar signal was real. The warning was valid, and the chance to prepare had existed for a brief, fragile moment, but it had vanished unheard, swallowed by complacency, uncertainty, and a fatal misunderstanding. At Opana Point, Elliot and Lockard stood in stunned silence as the echo of explosions faded into the distance. Their screens had shown the danger before it arrived, but no one had listened. Now the sky still smoked. The harbor still burned, and the world they had known an hour earlier was gone. Forever.
When the last Japanese aircraft disappeared into the northern sky, leaving behind a trail of smoke, fire, and silence, the island of Oahu lay transformed. The brilliant Sunday morning light now fell across twisted metal, sunken ships, shattered hangars, and rising plumes of black smoke. Pearl Harbor no longer shimmered with calm water, but boiled with burning oil, sailors struggling to survive, and the wrecks of battleships that only hours earlier had seemed untouchable. The attack was over, but its shadow stretched everywhere, from the harbor to the mountains, and all the way up to Opana Point, where Joseph Lockard and George Eliot stood motionless, staring at the distant smoke drifting over the island. They did not speak at first. There were no words large enough to measure the enormity of what they had witnessed, from the first ghostly blip on the oscilloscope to the explosions now staining the sky with grief. They had known before anyone else, and yet they had been powerless to stop it. Elliot finally exhaled, his breath shaky and heavy with regret. He murmured, "We saw them, Joe. We really saw them." Lockard nodded slow and quiet, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, and no one believed us." The silence inside the hut grew thick as they stepped back inside, the SCR-270 still humming dutifully, scanning the empty sky, unaware that history had just changed around it. The radar had worked. It had detected the first wave with accuracy that should have been impossible for such a new and untested technology. Yet its warning had died in a single phone call, dismissed without urgency, left to wither in the calm of an ordinary morning. The hours that followed blurred into a stream of reports, orders, confusion, and disbelief. Military headquarters scrambled to understand what had happened. Commanders raced to secure airfields, sailors fought fires for hours, and island civilians watched in horror from their homes several miles away. Rumors spread quickly. Early on, some whispered that a radar station had seen something, but that the report had been ignored. But few knew the details. Fewer still knew the names of the two young men who had been the first to see the approaching danger, long before the first bomb fell. It would take days before the full story reached the desks of senior officers, and even longer before Washington learned the truth. When investigators arrived at Opana Point later that afternoon, they questioned Lockard and Elliot in detail. The two men explained everything: the time of the sighting, the size of the formation, the sweep of the signal, and the call to the information center.
They explained how they had been told to stand down, not because their report lacked clarity, but because the officer on duty had no training, no context, and no reason to imagine that war had already crossed the Pacific. Investigators nodded, took notes, asked questions, but the truth weighed heavily on all of them. The warning had come, it had been clear, and it had been ignored. In the days that followed, Washington launched multiple inquiries, desperate to trace every failure, every gap in communication, every missed signal. The nation needed answers, but the truth was simple. Radar had given the first warning of modern warfare, and the world had not yet learned how to listen. Lieutenant Kermit T. Tyler, whose dismissal of the warning would haunt him for the rest of his life, insisted that he had acted according to the information available to him. He had been told about the incoming B-17 flight. He had not been briefed on radar procedures, and he had not been trained to distinguish enormous enemy formations from small friendly ones. He had been placed in a position he was not prepared for. A failure not of a single man, but of a system not yet adapted to new technology. Tyler carried that weight of the moment for decades, always explaining, always defending, always regretting. But he was not alone in his burden. The military had underestimated radar, seeing it as an experiment rather than a vital shield. They had placed inexperienced officers on duty during vulnerable hours, created no clear protocol for unusual sightings, and allowed critical warnings to be funneled through a single point instead of a coordinated network. Pearl Harbor had been a tragedy built not only of bombs and torpedoes, but of assumptions, underestimation, and the growing pains of a nation on the edge of modern war. For Lockard and Elliott, the days after the attack were a strange mix of recognition and sorrow. They received commendations for their alertness, even though their warning had achieved nothing. They felt pride that they had done their duty, but that pride was tangled with guilt, a guilt they did not deserve but could not escape. The scene of burning ships and shattered airfields lingered in their minds whenever they closed their eyes. They had seen the threat first, yet could not stop the destruction that followed. Over time, however, the significance of their warning grew clearer. Historians would later describe the Opana Point sighting as the first operational radar detection of an enemy attack in United States history, a moment that marked the birth of electronic early warning systems that would soon protect fleets, convoys, and entire nations. Radar stations multiplied across the Pacific, new training systems were developed, better communication networks built, and officers prepared with procedures that would never again allow such a warning to vanish into silence. The loss at Pearl Harbor forced the United States to transform, rapidly adopting radar not as a novelty, but as a cornerstone of its defense. The technology that had been ignored at dawn on December 7th became one of the most crucial tools of the war, guiding interceptors, coordinating fleets, detecting submarines, and shaping the future of air defense. By 1943, radar operators were no longer seen as technicians tinkering with experimental equipment. They were guardians of the sky, the first watch against surprise attack. Every time a radar screen lit up with incoming aircraft, somewhere across the Pacific, the ghost of Opana Point lived in the minds of commanders, reminding them that warnings ignored carried heavy costs. Decades later, Joseph Lockard would recall the events of that morning with a quiet, steady voice, explaining how the screen had lit up, how they had called, and how the world had still been at peace for those few fragile minutes. He never spoke with anger, only with the steady sadness of a man who had seen history coming and had been unable to make others see it. George Eliot, too, carried the memory through his life not with bitterness, but with the solemn understanding that sometimes history turns not on great decisions, but on small moments, on voices unheard, on warnings misunderstood, on a few young men staring at a flickering screen, wishing someone would believe them. Pearl Harbor would be rebuilt, the Pacific Fleet restored, the war won, and the world reshaped. But the lesson of that morning remained carved deep into the history of modern warfare. The first sign of danger no longer came from the sound of engines or the sight of distant aircraft. It came from the faint glowing trace of a radar signal, rising quietly against the noise of the world, a signal that two young soldiers once saw before anyone else, a signal that should have changed everything, but vanished into silence.